Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now today we're going to be comparing the RTX 4060 to the RTX 4060 Ti 8GB. I have here two Ventus 2X OC models, one a 4060 and one an 8GB 4060 Ti. They look very similar on the surface. The key differences between the two, aside from the name, is of course the change in CUDA cores and the fact that the 4060 is a 115 watt card and the 4060 Ti is a 160 watt card. The price difference of these two models here in the UK, it's about £80. I've seen the 4060 for about £269 and the 4060 Ti 8GB for about £350. So is it worth the difference? Well, let's get into our first game and see how these two compare. So we'll start with Assassin's Creed Mirage here. I've tested at 1080p for today's video, though if you want to see some 1440p tests, just let me know. We're running with the very high settings here. The 4060 is running the game with 110 FPS, a 1% low of 83 and a 0.1% low of 67. For the 4060 Ti 8GB, we're seeing 128 FPS, so an improvement of 18 frames per second, as well as an increase to the 1 and 0.1% lows coming in at 91 and 75. So it's a little more consistent with the 4060 Ti, but both cards don't have an issue with achieving at least 60 FPS at 1080p with decent quality settings. And I can pretty much say that for most of the titles tested today. The 4060 is certainly good enough, don't get me wrong, for 1080p 60 FPS gaming with high quality settings. Baldur's Gate 3 is where we notice even more of a difference between the two cards, quite a significant difference with the average frame rate here, 114 for the RTX 4060 but 147 for the 4060 Ti. The 1% low for the 4060 was 97. For the Ti, it was 110, and our percentile numbers were actually the same. So we still saw dips and drops with the RTX 4060 Ti. I'm using a 14900K, limited to 125 watts for the CPU, just to ensure that we are getting the most performance out of our cards today. There is no CPU bottleneck going on here, that's for sure. The reason I limit the i9 is because it keeps it a little bit cooler under load. It loses a few percentage points performance wise, but it's still pretty good. Anyway, this video is of course about the graphics card, so let's move on to our next test, the Black Myth Wukong benchmark 1080p high here. Now this is one of the more demanding games I've tested today, and as you can see the RTX 4060 is actually dipping below 60 frames per second. 55 was the average with a 1% low of 48 and a 0.1% low of 46. The 4060 Ti meant the difference between a sub 60 FPS average and a plus 60 FPS average, 66 frames per second here, although we did still see the occasional dip below this. 57 was that 1% low, which is improved over that of the 4060s, and our 0.1% figure came in at 54. So pretty smooth across the board, pretty smooth for both cards to be honest. And like I said before, the 4060 I think is still an okay card, but it depends on the price and what else is about for similar money, of course. Don't forget to check out the AMD options too. Call of Duty Black Ops 6 next. Now I didn't use the in-game benchmark run because it performed exactly the same on both cards. We were getting 92 FPS and I just thought that isn't quite right. We should see a bit more of a performance difference. So I set up this sort of custom test where I basically just followed the same route around one of the maps here. The 4060 hit 90 FPS, which is what we were seeing in the benchmark, basically a 1% low of 73 and a 0.1% low of 71. The difference here was clearer to see with the 4060 Ti coming in with 116 FPS, a 1% low of 96 and a 0.1% low of 91. So figures much improved across the board here, but the 4060 of course still delivers a very playable experience. Cyberpunk 2077 next. 1080p at Ultra, the 4060 did impress me here, 102 FPS with the benchmark run, a 1% low of 78 and a 0.1% low of 72. We saw about 15 frames more on average with the 4060 Ti. It was improved across the board. Gameplay of course will differ too between these two cards, but it's a decent effort for both of them, and considering the price difference of £80, well I'd be inclined to stick to the 4060 for decent settings, 1080p gameplay. Next up we have Fortnite. Now this is quite hard to bench side by side, of course, because it's an online game, you never know what's going to happen. So what I did was just set up the same route around the map like I did with the Call of Duty Black Ops 6 benchmark here, and hoped that no enemies would wipe me out as I was progressing through this little level. The time difference is slightly, well, different of course, because in one instance we have nighttime and in one instance we have daytime, but that shouldn't really impact the frame rate too much. Just to be sure, however, I did run this test 3 times with each card across different weather scenarios and took an average. So what you're seeing here is the performance difference between the two: 83 FPS for the 4060 and 98 for the 4060 Ti, with very similar 1% lows and disastrous 0.1% lows. A little bit of stutter here and there. Red Dead Redemption 2 next, ultra textures with everything else set to high. Interestingly, if you go with ultra across the board, then you're going to see some dips in performance significantly below 60 frames per second, to be honest, especially in and around busier areas like Saint Denis. The 4060 hit 95 frames per second, so very impressive, with a consistent set of percentile figures, 77 and 71. For the 4060 Ti 8GB, we saw 115 frames per second, so 20 FPS more on average, with an improved 1% figure and an improved 0.1% figure as well. 77 and 71 compared to 91 and 84. Remember, it's not always about averages. The percentile numbers, in my opinion, are just as important because they can make it clear whether or not we're experiencing stutter or inconsistencies with certain games. Not that any of that really happened with either of these two cards. I think they're both decent 1080p gaming cards, but let down a little by the price. Finally, we have Starfield. Now, just like the Black Myth Wukong benchmark here, we are seeing less than 60 frames per second on the 4060 non-Ti. That's 54 on average, with a 1% low of 43 and a 0.1% low of 29. I'm taking my usual benchmark route around Aquila, which really does push hardware to its limits, especially at higher settings. The 4060 Ti hit 67 FPS with a 1% low of 52, and we saw the same 0.1% number, which was 29. And I think this occurred during the same part. As we go down these stairs in a moment, you're going to see some hefty frame dips. This part's always quite demanding on hardware. Not sure what happens here that makes it so, but yeah, a noticeable difference, but not a massively significant one, and both cards have done fairly well today. That's all for this comparison then. Let me know what you think down below. Do you think the price difference is worth it between the 4060 and the 4060 Ti for the performance that you get? Leave all your thoughts down below. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.